So welcome everyone to our session on how to be the next Somerville. We're talking about sex-positive political organizing today, and hopefully go into pretty good depth here. So I think this will be a kind of cool session because we spent a lot of the rest of the weekend looking at how to really dive into pleasure, and this will be more of the activism part of pleasure activism. So really excited to be here discussing that today. A couple of logistical things. So you are welcome to ask questions in the Zoom chat, but we'll be addressing a Q&A at the end of the session. So we won't get to your questions right away. Also, we'll be doing some real-time polling during the session, so you can participate and give us a little bit more information about where you stand in terms of understanding sex-positive issues. That will only work if you're in the Zoom. So if you're watching from StreamYard, you will not be able to participate, but you will be able to see the polling. Let's see. Otherwise, I'd like to introduce my two co-presenters. So we have Mark Press, who is the president of the Sex Positive Democratic Club in San Francisco. And we're also joined by Alex, who is a future board member, and also who spent 8 years as the senior congressional aide to Nancy Pelosi. So we're really excited to have these two speakers to just talk a little bit more about sex-positive issues, legal issues, and also an approach to how we can actually make legislation that really enables us to have these pleasurable lives. So I think with that, that's probably all the logistics, and I'll turn it over to Mark to give some intro into the club and also some of the sex-positive legal issues that we're facing today.
There we go. Unmuting myself would help. Thank you, Amanda. Yes, so we are the San Francisco Sex Positive Democratic Club. We advocate for all sex positive communities, but we kind of have 4 focal areas, and that is non-monogamous folk, queer folk, the BDSM community, and sex workers, all of which are communities that either in the past or currently have faced discrimination under the law. There are a lot of amazing organizations like Bonobo and others that are doing great education work, great social work, kind of normalizing sex positivity, educating around consent and all these different issues. That's not what we do. We focus specifically on legal and political issues. And there are always kind of like some questions about what those are, but there are a lot of legal barriers to folks in sex positive communities living our lives the way that we want to, whether that's discrimination in employment, benefits issues that where monogamously married folks have legal advantage that other folks don't have access to, prohibitions on sex work, censorship, a lot of different stuff. But one that I think is really applicable to Bonobo, which is the organization putting this wonderful thing on, there's a lot of issues around venues actually for sex positive events, not only in zoning and regulation and health code stuff that's used to kind of push us out of the core of the city and push us into kind of obscure places and kind of really limit our options for where we can host events, but also around nudity and sex and alcohol, which is like a weird thing that is kind of used to really marginalize the events that we host. So Bonobo is actually a really great example of how to make things work in a system that's designed to keep us out. So other communities can host events in public spaces like bars, where they're able to keep costs low for attendees because you can kind of subsidize the event through alcohol sales. But sex positive communities don't have that option, like I said, due to zoning, due to health code, but also there are laws that prohibit alcohol sales in places that there's nudity or sex, at least in California. No, not everyone here is in California, but because of these laws, they cost you, unless you have a private space of your own, you end up having to rent a private space. And that makes it really cost prohibitive. So a lot of what ends up happening is that these parties end up being really expensive, which leads to unequal access, so that only folks that have money or privilege or access to these spaces are able to participate. And Bonobo is an organization that does a really great job of including people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, giving volunteer opportunities so people can attend. But you can't avoid the fact that you need money and lots of it to make these things work. And oftentimes they're either not viable at all, or they become incredibly cost prohibitive, which leads to one of the frequent concerns in sex positive communities, which is how white and how wealthy these spaces end up being. And that's a direct result of these laws that make it difficult for us to host the kind of events we want, for us to have the kind of community that we want. And then by doing so, it limits the access that communities of color and people of lower socioeconomic backgrounds have to these spaces. And that is a direct result of the law, which is why we have to be activists for sex positive issues, just as one example. So I want to hand it over to Amanda now for our first question, which everyone in Zoom should get.
Yeah, so let me launch the first poll. This one is designed just to give us kind of an overview of who's in the room and what kind of sex positive issues you care about. Your answers will be anonymous, so they're not tied to your identity in any way, and we'll show instant results as soon as most of you have voted.
So this is just so we have an idea of who we're talking to, what issues we're concerned about. I don't even know how many people we have on this call. Oh, quite a few. Awesome.
Looks like one last person hasn't voted. Give them, yep.
Let's see who we got. There we go. A lot of non-monogamous folks, as we expected from this crowd, a lot of queer folks, a lot of kinky folks, a few sex workers. We're very happy to have you, and a small number of folks who are none of the above.
So I am personally excited about how many non-monogamous folks are in the room. And I think this next section will be particularly applicable to all of you. So some of you might have heard the news about a month and a half ago that Somerville, Massachusetts quietly passed a domestic partnership ordinance. And that ordinance gives the same marital rights to polyamorous groups, polyamorous relationships, as it does to monogamous folks. So this is super exciting. As far as we know, it's the first ordinance of its type in the country. And I'd like to turn it over to Mark to give a little bit more details on the ordinance and also the approach Somerville took, and maybe some context on what approaches we're taking in San Francisco.
Thank you, Amanda. Yeah, so what they did is actually really interesting and legally very simple, which is kind of cool. They basically took the existing kind of framework for domestic partnership, and every place where they had two people, they put people. And when it said both, like they used they instead of he or she, and they used they replaced all these binary adverbs basically with, or is that grammatically correct? I don't know. They replaced all these binary words with pluralistic words, which basically just simply created the same kind of system for domestic partnership that exists for monogamous folks. Now, that includes some of the benefits of marriage. That includes hospital visitation, shared property, a number of those things. It doesn't necessarily include all of them. I see, where is that new law? That is Somerville, Massachusetts. So it doesn't necessarily include all benefits of marriage. So tax advantage that married people have is a federal issue. So unless there is a federal statute, that wouldn't be applicable. And then it's unclear about benefits that you get from employment, because depending on how the domestic partnership law is written, it may or may not apply to public employers versus private employers versus small businesses. So it's unclear as of yet how that will apply. But I really didn't think this was going to happen anytime this decade. So I'm really excited about it. Before this happened, we here in San Francisco, and also some folks in Berkeley, were taking a slightly different approach. We've been working on an anti-discrimination ordinance. So they actually started this in Berkeley, and we kind of they got it through the first reading. It's not like enacted yet, weird legal hurdles. And we, as the San Francisco Sex Positive Democratic Club, have been working with our mayor's office and the supervisors here in San Francisco to try to move forward a similar ordinance. And what this would do is, so there are all these anti-discrimination ordinances on the books. It is illegal to discriminate against any protected class, which includes, you can't discriminate based on race, religion, sexual orientation, etc. So we want to make it illegal to discriminate based on relationship structure, meaning the number of people in a relationship or your inclination towards a relationship with any number of people. And frequently when I talk about this, people kind of get confused. They're like, are non-monogamous people really discriminated against? So the question that I always ask when I get this from non-monogamous folks, which I often do, is, which we're gonna ask right now, are you out as non-monogamous at work? We're gonna have a survey question right here. I think we had 83% of the people in the room were non-monogamous. Once again, these are anonymous. This is only, we will only get a percentage. We will not get your name or any other info. This is just for a demonstration.
Waiting for the last two people here.
If it's only two, we can probably just go ahead. That's fine. There we go. 2/3 of the folks here, include a tenth of you aren't non-monogamous, which is great. We're happy to have you. Happy you care about these issues. Two-thirds of the folks here aren't out at work and are non-monogamous. And I know not everyone here is in the same region. I know that I'm here in San Francisco, and a lot of the folks on these calls are here in the Bay Area. And this is one of the most liberal places in the world. And presumably most of us here live in really liberal places. And the fact that we are not out tells you something, right? And I mean, there's a lot of reasons why people wouldn't be out. But one of them is, if it's not a protected class, there is no legal issue with discriminating. You can be fired for being non-monogamous because it is not a protected class. And this is the thing that I always talk about is, like, it's totally normal at like in workplace conversation at the water cooler back when we still went to offices and had water coolers, for people to say, oh yeah, over the weekend I was at the beach with my girlfriend on Saturday. But then if I say, oh yeah, I was at the beach on Saturday with my girlfriend and at the park on Sunday with my boyfriend, suddenly I get looked like I have three heads, and I can get reported to HR for inappropriate workplace conversation for literally having the same conversation as anyone else, the only difference being the number of relationships that I'm in. And if that makes someone uncomfortable that I have a different lifestyle than them, I can be fired for it. And this is really similar to how it was to be LGBT in the workplace up until really recently. I mean, in California, it only became illegal to discriminate completely on sexual orientation in 1992. Nationwide, it was just this year. Like this is brand new for LGBT folks, and if you look culturally, LGBT folks have been a lot more present for a lot longer than non-monogamous folks, and we're still much earlier in our kind of progression of kind of addressing the discrimination that we're facing and coming out and being a social force. And I believe now we have another question coming up about discrimination.
Yeah, so this question is actually one of my favorites, because I think in the poly community and the non-monogamous community, we're often so closeted that we don't actually realize there are many types of discrimination that we're facing. And I kind of personally love getting people's stories about discrimination they have faced for non-monogamy. Just fascinating to hear.
So yes, we'd love to hear how many folks have been subjected to these various kinds of discrimination. I think these polls are really fun. I hope you all do too. I think it's cool to kind of get a feel for everyone's experience.
Okay. Got most people voted, so I'm going to end the poll.
And we will have a couple opportunities for folks to speak later on. Okay. So we have a few cases here and there of employment discrimination, housing discrimination, marital rights, other, and a lot of folks who don't think they've been discriminated against, which is interesting and valid. So, I mean, wait, where am I in my notes right here? Yeah, so I think one of the interesting things is, like, a lot of folks, even if they're not afraid of necessarily getting fired, a lot of folks don't come out because they're afraid of the way that it can affect their likelihood for getting a promotion, or their kind of career trajectory, or their, you know, their social status, right? It's not just about legal barriers, but law impacts those social norms. And when you have law to protect folks, people are more inclined to actually view them as whole people, which is kind of interesting if you look at, you know, the acceptability of LGBT folks in America over time. You see this like slow tick upwards starting in the 1960s, and then we had marriage equality approved through the Supreme Court, and suddenly there's a sharp upward spike in approval throughout America. So law does impact culture and vice versa. So if we create protected class status, we'll be able to provide protections in employment, housing, and public accommodation. That's what we're looking at here in San Francisco right now, because that's how the current anti-discrimination ordinance is written. We'd love to do work with child custody, but that's going to require a separate law because that's not included in those existing ordinances. And domestic partnership, as we discussed, could bring some of the benefits that marriage and monogamous marriage can bring. But one of the, as a person who works professionally in politics, I always think of like what they're going to say against us. And the thing I always worry about is like, oh, you're just trying to get all of your friends and partners health insurance through your employer, which yes, but I personally think the solution to that problem is really just to, you know, as Democrats, we are a democratic organization, fight for universal health care. Right? Like if we can just disconnect healthcare from employment, then we don't have to have that fight. But that's my personal axe to grind on that one. And I think now, Amanda, you're going to take it away to offer opportunities for a couple folks to speak about discrimination if they want to.
Yeah, so as I said, we love hearing stories about discrimination. And it looks like there are 8 of you who said that you have experienced discrimination before. So we would love to invite you, if you would like, to share your stories. We probably have time for 1 or 2 stories, and we'd ask you to keep them under 3 minutes. So if you're interested, feel free to jump in.
So they raise their hand in Zoom or whatever. I'm not sure if you're controlling who's muted or not.
Mm-hmm. Or maybe if anyone wants to share, they can put it in the chat.
Yeah, that works too. I'm also just seeing how much is going on in the chat. I'm sorry that I haven't been reading it all along. This is very active and I can't wait to read it all later. And if no one feels like sharing any stories right now, we can kind of move on to the next chunk. Yeah, so I think the next thing we wanted to cover is the 3 approaches to changing law. So there are these 3 kind of large buckets for how you do change law. One of which is litigation, so the courts, legislation, so laws that are passed by either local, state, or national legislatures. So you're from everything from the U.S. Congress down to your county board of supervisors or city council, and then referenda or ballot measures, which are very popular in California. But I think as an example for these 3 different ways of changing law, I'm going to hand it over to Alex to kind of cover the history of the marriage equality movement, because it kind of includes all 3 of those along the way.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, so we touched upon the marriage equality movement here and there, as well as recent developments in LGBTQII rights. One main takeaway, particularly with what happened in Somerville, is that the road to put into place laws that benefit our community or any community can often be full of cul-de-sacs where you have to turn around and go back, or dead ends where all of a sudden, you know, you have to give up on the idea because of legislation or because of something that happened in a court ruling or something of that sort. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the end of the road. It can often be a long slog though. So one good parallel with marriage equality, now we are of course the San Francisco sex positive Positive Democratic Club, I've always considered the city and county of San Francisco like a political petri dish, where if it works here, it may or may not work elsewhere. We could talk about medical marijuana. Here we're talking about domestic partnerships. So actually in 1982, Supervisor Harry Britt, who ended up replacing Supervisor Harvey Milk after he was assassinated, started creating legislation in regards to domestic partnerships in San Francisco to be able to benefit the employees of the city and county of San Francisco. So that happened legislatively through the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. Just a quick note, the supervisors in San Francisco are like a city council. San Francisco is a consolidated city and council, so it overlaps. So the functions of a city council are very similar to the functions of a Board of Supervisors, but they do hold a lot of power. Also, one of the reasons why it's considered a petri dish, because it's very unique that way. So it has a strong mayor system where the mayor has the ability to veto legislation. And now current Senator Dianne Feinstein actually ended up vetoing Supervisor Britt's legislation. The one thing to throw out there is that oftentimes you will have to change the minds of your allies. People that are against you at one time will eventually turn around and you will be your advocates, like Senator Feinstein, like Vice Presidential candidate Joe Biden, or even President Obama. So, but back to San Francisco in the early 80s. So, Senator Feinstein went off, and then Supervisor Britt kept going back to domestic partnerships. It was actually eventually signed into law by Mayor Art Agnos, which was a great victory. But as I mentioned, then you have a roadblock, because what ended up happening is, and then there was a referendum where the domestic partnership law was repealed by the voters of San Francisco. So, you pass something legislatively, somebody doesn't like it, they challenge it in the courts, and then or through ballot legislation, and then all of a sudden it's gone and it's stripped away from you. You can fast forward to 2008 when the same thing happened again with marriage equality in California. So the main takeaway, of course, is never give up. Is when you hit these cul-de-sacs, when you hit these roadblocks, there are other ways of doing things. So he introduced a Proposition K, which reinstalled domestic partnerships. Eventually, you start playing three-dimensional chess. You start, forming coalitions with your local assembly people from the state, or local federal officials from the federal representatives. So he ended up partnering up with Assembly Member Carol Migden, who then introduced an assembly bill here in California. And then we became California the first state that created domestic partnerships without the intervention of a court. Just to go into a little nuance there, Hawaii's legislature enacted a more expensive form of domestic partnerships, but that was in response to an unfavorable court ruling. So all these are little fun things that we can do research on our own. But Vermont was another place where a sweeping civil rights union bill in about year 2000 was able to achieve that goal there. So, rolling into marriage itself, right? I mean, you have your domestic partnerships, that's great. But then, there are some unique qualities that marriage has, particularly with taxes, as Mark mentioned, with healthcare, being able to visit your partner in a hospital, again, domestic partnerships only went to a certain point. To achieve the next step, it would be the next goal. Now, this is where, to identify Congressman John Lewis, who also passed away earlier this year. Sometimes you have to get into good trouble. Sometimes you have to disrupt. And here in California, we have Governor Gavin Newsom, who back then was Mayor Gavin Newsom. Young guy, went up through the Board of Supervisors, obviously a lot of ambition. We've all seen it with our own two eyes. And he decided to, one day in 2004, go ahead and allow same-sex marriages in San Francisco. And I definitely remember those days clearly. I was a little raver kid back then. I was coming into my queerness. I was running around in all these parties and so forth. And all of a sudden you see on the news that City Hall, there's lines wrapped around San Francisco City Hall, and marriages are starting to happen. And that was great and all. Now, Gavin Newsom knew this was going to be disrupted and this was going to be challenged in the courts. We can go back to the Supervisor Harry Britt example, where you go forward a little bit and all of a sudden there's a cul-de-sac that that you're going to have to turn around for whatever reason. So sure enough, it was challenged in courts. And then there were ballot measures that were introduced to make this permanent, right? So now you see your multiple layers of things. You get into good trouble, you challenge the system challenges you through legislation. Then you start going into how you can actually make this happen, either through official legislation or through a ballot measure where the voters have a say. So it's very exhausting and it's very stressful in order to get something passed, to get things going through this system, because you cannot give up and you have to identify your allies, make sure that you keep that momentum going. That resulted in Proposition 8 in California, where Proposition 8 was put into place to remove marriage equality after it had succeeded through the other systems. Very similar again to the domestic partnership law that Supervisor Britt put into legislation. It was approved, but then it was vetoed by the voters. There is, of course, ideas and theories that the voters didn't know what they were doing, because the way that the Yes on Prop 8 campaign played everything, it implied that it was for marriage equality when in fact it was actually against it. So it ended up succeeding. And then it went back to court. And this is where you go like a little bit forward and then a few steps back. And it's very well possible that people lose momentum and give up at that point. But you just kind of have to keep the process going, because it's very risky because you can lose. But if you succeed, you succeed. So it ended up going back to court, and then you scroll, forward to 2013, when marriage equality was approved in California, and legislation removing a man and a woman happened in 2014 from the state law here in California. So all of a sudden, California is in good shape when it came down to marriage equality. Did it happen throughout the country? No. But eventually the momentum from the state of California, and of course other places in our country who moved the needle forward, either through disruption, either through ballot legislation, or either through legislation itself, it succeeded throughout the country. And so that's just a good example of the fact that you take 5 steps forward, you might take 10 steps back. You cannot give up. Always expect that. But once you start triangulating, once you go through the disruption part, the ballot part, the legislation part, you have a lot more case. You start to change the minds of people. You start to bring people to the table. You start to make this an idea that is not just something that is, oh, it'd be great to have that someday. It becomes something that we are fighting, some group is fighting out there now. So rather than continue on, I'll hand it over to Mark and I'll chime in on a little bit.
Thank you, Alex. I appreciate the history lesson there. I just think it's important to kind of note the long arc of this thing, right? We go back to the Stonewall riots were in 1969, and also for those that don't know, in San Francisco we had the Compton's cafeteria riots 3 years beforehand. We're actually doing a watch party this Thursday, the San Francisco Sex Positive Democratic Club, of a documentary about that. It features a lot of amazing trans folks and sex workers. Check it out. It's going to be awesome. For all the way from the late 60s until 2015, when Obergefell v. Hodges, the Supreme Court case that made marriage equality the law of the land, that's a really long arc of history. And I used to be saying like we as non-monogamous folks and the sex positive folks are kind of in like the Harvey Milk era, so like the 1970s equivalent of advocacy for non-monogamous issues. But with this Somerville law, we may be closer to the Gavin Newsom era. I don't know. But the point is, this is a long process, probably 20-ish years at least, until we have non-monogamous folks being treated equally under the law as monogamous folks. And it is going to take all 3 of these legislative approaches, legislation, litigation, and referenda, in order for us to get where we need to be, just like the marriage equality movement that did also use not only executive action on the local level with Gavin Newsom, but also lots of legislation, lots of court action, ballot measures are all along the way. So these are all kind of the tools that we have as like voters and individuals, but also that our legislators have and that our government has. So I think we're going to break out these 3 different ways of passing law, and I'm going to hand it back to Alex to cover litigation, so the courts.
Yeah, One thing that you just reminded me of as you were making those points, Mark, is another good parallel is the legalization of cannabis and how that, started with medical marijuana on a local level. And then, for example, here in California, it became, a referendum to make it legal throughout the state of California. But then, of course, now that there's a patchwork of laws of, it may be legal in California, but in this county, you can't do this. And in that county, you can't do that. So understand again that you take one step forward and you're going to find some more challenges. It's almost like, I'm in the process of buying a house. So it's just like that. It's like you're going to find issues with the foundation. You're going to have issues with the structure. And that's when you have to politically identify the structure, see where you can fix it, see where you can make change. Litigation being a very good example of that, because, you do the Gavin Newsom thing. You pass something in California, but it's not until legislation happens and the courts officially, grant that right is when people can actually breathe a sigh of relief. I don't know about you all, but pretty much for the past decade, every June when the Supreme Court has released whatever, it's like this tightening of like, what are they going to do about DACA? What are they going to do about healthcare? But that is the legislative, the litigation portion of things. Now, I'm not an attorney, so I can't go into much more detail about litigation, but I will hand it back to Mark in regards to ballot measures.
Yeah, I'm also not an attorney. And I just wanted to say, if you're not really rich or really plugged in, you as an individual, litigation is probably not your best approach unless you are the victim of some sort of discrimination, in which case there are many wonderful nonprofits like the ACLU and a bunch of other organizations that can possibly take your case as a test case for some of these different legal issues. But for ballot measures, so I'm here in San Francisco. We in California, and especially the Bay Area, are very ballot measure happy. I don't know what we didn't ask where people are. I don't know where everyone is, but we are a very ballot measure happy state and region. And why that is a really weird story that goes back to the 1800s and railroads, basically railroading, if you will, the state legislature. It's really weird. But we like to put things on the ballot. But I would argue for the kind of things that we're talking about, minority rights, the ballot is not the best place to deal with the issues that we're talking about. And that's for a number of reasons. One of which being it's incredibly expensive. So because you have to get signatures, usually unless you have a ton of volunteers, you end up paying signature gatherers to get signatures in the first place, which is a whole other thing that I take huge issue with. But you have to get a bunch of signatures to get on the ballot. And then you have to convince 50+% of the voters in either the city, region, state, whatever you're trying to pass it in, that this is a good idea. And you have to campaign for it. And you have to, create this infrastructure to communicate with voters and to like convince a large number of people. And then even after you've done it, if you want to change anything about the language, you have to go back to the ballot. So it's actually a really imprecise tool that locks in a bunch of things. This is also like why we can't fund anything in California, because we passed this law, Prop 13 in the 70s, that like screws over tax structures. Ballot measures aren't the best tool, especially for the kind of thing that we're talking about, where we're talking about minority rights, not like the betterment of all necessarily. So that is the opposite case for legislation, where legislation you really only have to convince a small number of legislators. And this is the beauty of being in a democratic republic and not a pure democracy, is that you really can balance majority rule with minority rights. And we have representatives who we task with making sure that the protections are in place for minorities. And in this case, we're talking about sexual minorities, but all minorities. It kind of fit into that structure. So I want to pass it back to Alex again to talk about legislation and lobbying.
So legislation is, I guess, the most traditional path when it comes down to making change. You definitely need to put things into place and be very thorough in regards to to making your ideas known to your elected officials. And one of the clearest ways of doing that is lobbying your elected officials. Now, most times people think that lobbying is like, you know, a cisgender white man in a lobby of a, you know, city hall somewhere or state capitol, meeting with a legislator in the hallway and then, you know, giving them their idea. But that doesn't necessarily need to be that way. One of the things that I did for the 8 years that I worked for the speaker was I was her point of contact in the district for any constituents that would come to advocate for their goals. I mean, we all know about Medicare for all. That's been advocated for a very long time. You know, that's not something new. This has been going on for a very long time. But you know, if you're an interest group, let's just say like Moms Demand Action, right? So Moms Demand Action was born out of the Sandy Hook massacre, and that created a group of moms who then, you know, went to their local elected officials, state elected officials, federal officials, lobbying for gun legislation. There's another group called Little Lobbyists, which is like children and little kids, and their ideas are about healthcare and about trying to make sure that systems like Medicaid throughout the country are preserved and are there for people that, you know, can't take care of their children because they have special needs or something of that nature. So lobbyist is something that you can do. You can lobby at your local grocery store if you come across a congresswoman. And that's a really clear example because that's how I ended up in politics. My congresswoman in San Jose used to come in and I used to bag her groceries. I didn't lobby her then, but that happens, you know. When I was working for the speaker and when I was working for the mayor, you know, people would go up to these elected officials and talk to them about what it was that was their concern. Yeah, sometimes they were macro level, like my benefits or the encampment outside my house, but oftentimes it was, yes, like, what are you doing about this particular legislation? So understand that lobbying is not evil and that every grassroots organization or a union, many nonprofits, they all have lobbying groups. That's just the nature of things. It's the way the game is played. I mean, I don't want to get into too much of a tangent, but you know, you talk about like term limits. And one of the things that I've always been afraid of with term limits is the fact that lobbyists get an extreme amount of power. We had some change in term limit laws here in California where they were shortened. And what that ended up doing is giving power to lobbyists because they were ready to write laws and just plug it in to this young elected official, or not necessarily young in age, but new to their role. Handing it over, that person did not know, you know, how to get around the Capitol, let alone how to write legislation yet, and it just gave this undue influence to lobbyists. So you know, just wanted to make that point very briefly, but I'll hand it over to Mark to continue this thought.
Yes, I do have a couple things to add on lobbying. Like Alex said, lobbying it's not inherently evil. Yes, there are gun industry lobbyists. Yes, there are oil industry lobbyists, and yes, those people suck. But every organized group, every grassroots organization that obtains a substantial size has lobbyists. You think like some of the most powerful lobbyists in America right now are Planned Parenthood's lobbyists. They do a ton of work. There are a lot of organizations out there that have lobbyists and who are doing that work. And also to kind of double back on something else is lobbying actually serves an essential purpose in the legislative process. So we think about lobbyists as being these people who are like trying to buy votes or trying to influence people, but that's not necessarily the case. Really what it is lobbyists are just are groups of people that have aligned interests who are advocating as a group. And the beauty of that is like, because there are lobbyists for, like I said, everything. There is a Beekeepers Association lobbying group. And the thing about legislators is we elect them for whatever reason, because they're charismatic, because they share our views, that we share, because whatever. We don't necessarily elect them because they are experts on everything, and they can't be. No one legislator can know everything about every industry, about every policy. And the purpose, the actual functional purpose of lobbying within the legislative system is that they educate legislators on the issues of concern to the groups that they're advocating for. Whether those be teachers, whether they be shitbag corporations. Like it doesn't, but the point is that the legislators can't know everything. And someone has to communicate to the legislators what their concerns are and what legal barriers they're facing and what legislators can do to help them. And that is true of any special interest group. And you are all in at least a dozen special interest groups, whether you recognize it or not, depending on race, gender, career, whatever. We're all in special interest groups, every single one of us. Some of us are just more engaged with them than others, right? So lobbyists can communicate the concerns of special interest groups to legislators and recommend action. In that vein, unless you happen to be independently wealthy or very powerful or very famous, you as an individual don't have a lot of power in lobbying your elected officials. But what you can do is organize. You can become a special interest group. You can find people who share your concerns, who share your values, who share the approach that you think should be taken in rectifying the issues that you see in law, and you can create an organization or join an organization, and you can advocate for those as a group. Because yes, if you as an individual just show up to public comment at some random city council meeting and just talk about whatever, yes, they're going to look at you like you're a crackpot and ignore you. But if you and 30 of your friends show up with the same message, with the same concerns, that is lobbying. And that can actually have a large impact. And then you can also walk the halls with that same group of people and go to legislators' offices and have set up conversations with their aides. Just a random side note, if you walk into a legislator's office, don't ask for a meeting with the legislator unless you are really far along. Ask for a conversation with one of their aides. Someone like Alex, who is fucking brilliant and knows their stuff, will sit down with you and will hear you out. And you can work with them about what the legislative approach should be for the issues that you're concerned about. So after that long rant, I think we have another question from Amanda about how you have been engaged in the political process. Just so we can kind of get a feel for the level of experience with organizing in this room. Oh, Amanda, this is not a multiple choice.
Oh, is it not?
This is a choose one. I know I've done all of these.
The one that calls for them.
Is it possible to resend that with choose as many?
Let me see if I can change it. It may take me a minute.
Hold on one moment, folks, for the revised version of that question. But yeah, I just there are many ways that you as an individual can be an activist and can be effective. We've talked a lot about lobbying because obviously I and Alex both have some experience with that approach, and I think it can be very effective. But also, direct action obviously serves an essential purpose, right? You think about what's been happening the last 2 months with Black Lives Matter. You think about the March on Washington. You think about all of these large demonstrations. That obviously has an impact. If not directly on law, it has an impact of changing the cultural conversation that we're having. And there are a lot of folks out there who are much better organizers than me on that front, who can speak much more acutely to direct action and protest and civil disobedience. That is not my specialty. I deal with things by walking the halls and having conversations with legislators, as well as campaigning. That's my actual background, as I work on campaigns. Do we have any progress on that question, Amanda?
Give me 2 more minutes.
2 more minutes. Okay. Well then, let me hand it back to Alex for a second while we finish that one up, to talk about how you can get involved in local politics.
Sure. Well, one of the good things that you all are doing now is joining this conversation. I know that we're all kind of sequestered and we have really no other choice to just figure out what things to do. But this is really great because you're interacting with folks that have the same mindset as you. It builds a sense of community, even though we're all disconnected right now. But it's important to do that. One of the things that I did when I was working for the speaker was that I was very involved in the local Democratic clubs. That's how I got to know Mark. We were on the board of the United Democratic Club together when that club was in its infancy. There were long standing clubs like the Alice B. Toklas Democratic Club in San Francisco that has been around for almost 40 years. I involved myself in that, Latino clubs, etc. Because that again is a good way for you to get that energy, that buzz of being in a community that you may not agree on 1000%, but at least you're able to have good conversations and volley thoughts off each other and really build a support group. So one really important thing to do is to find groups in your area that you can join. This club here, the Sex Positive Dems, is a really great club if you all are in the Bay Area or in California even. I think we're expanding our footprint away from just San Francisco. Also support candidates who share your views. So I spoke about people and getting, making friends, but also get to know those candidates, get to know your city council member, get to know who your legislatures are in the state, in the Congress, federally. You just need to know these people because they are working for you, and I mean, I keep going back to the speaker. I still have a good relationship with her. And one of the things that she really taught me is that you work for the people. You don't work for, that's it. You don't work for the lobbyists. You don't work for your donors. Like the people are the ones who cast their ballot and you have to help them out. And so these folks should be listening to you. They should be ready to take your call. They should be ready to take your email. I was going to say to take your letter, but that's not happening nowadays. The U.S. Postal Service, whole different story. Showing up at their doorstep, I would advise making a call and making sure that you have somebody there, so you're not just showing up out of the blue. You, like Mark mentioned, you may be speaking to a scheduler, you may be speaking to an aide, sometimes maybe an intern. Don't get discouraged by that because those notes eventually get to the elected official. Many elected officials, such as like the mayor of San Francisco, they have inboxes where they get all the emails and they make tallies of how many people are calling about this today, how many people are calling about that today. So, in your groups, in your clubs, if you can get everyone coordinated to call their local Congress person or their local city council person on one day, then that person will receive 10 messages that day about what action that you want to pursue. So know who your candidates are, know who your elected officials are. Know that local races the margins are very small and votes really matter. Not a lot of people vote, as we unfortunately know, but like, for example, back in the city of county in San Francisco, a lot of supervisors have won on a margin of like 2,000 votes or hundreds actually. Like there was last year, there was a race that was lost by 100 votes. It all makes a difference. It really is important to vote and to get your friends to go out and vote as well. Okay, so I'll just address the elephant in the room really briefly. I don't want to get too partisan, even though that happens in these conversations. But you have your parties. You have your Democratic Party, your Republican Party. Getting to know the structure of how the party works is helpful. You're not going to agree 1,000% on everything that the parties talk about. So you may not even want to be part of a party. So I'm just going to continue to cruise past that and let you all do your own research in regards to how you can get involved in your local party system. A con would be, again, is that they might have some rules and there's a lot of, it's kind of scary. Like you kind of think about it like a political machine and, oh, these people will, well, where did you come from? And what have you done? But that's just part of joining any community and any new group. So let me just kind of cruise on through here. Community organizations, also really good. I mentioned the Democratic clubs, but there's a lot of times unions, a lot of times, nonprofit organizations that will be advocating for something. Like unions are a really good example. Labor councils, they really are able to marshal their members when it comes down to actually helping people turn out to vote. I mean, that's the bottom line. People chase endorsements of like the Teamsters, or even like, the Screen Actors Guild, and it's for votes for a certain reason to get a cause and to get a goal met. So know that. I'll go back to all that. Yeah, I've touched upon our city council, i.e. local government, our state government, and federal government. So I'll throw it back to Mark briefly just to fill in any blanks.
Great. Amanda, do we have that question ready now?
Yep. Launch now.
Now we have the choose as many as you like. for those of us that do all of them.
Also, while people are voting, it looks like we're coming up on 10 minutes here. Do we want to maybe take a look at questions in the chat and address some of those?
Great idea.
Yeah, we don't have a whole lot more in my extensive notes here that we need to get to, other than kind of
speak up if there's anything that we didn't cover.
Yeah, I did see a question in here about the policies that we're looking at for the various groups that we advocate for. So as I did say at the top, we advocate for non-monogamous folk, queer folk, BDSM community, and sex workers. We are a very queer-heavy club, but also there are a lot of other amazing organizations working on queer issues. So that usually isn't our top-line concern, except for the one thing that I always point out, like I'm bisexual, and I often feel that a lot of the queer advocacy groups aren't necessarily concerned with bisexual issues or necessarily trans issues or non-binary issues as much as they are often concerned with gay and lesbian issues. So we do try to make sure that we are being representative of the full breadth of the LGBTQ community. What do we have here? A lot of direct action folks. I appreciate you. That is not my strength.
Getting into good
organizers, campaigners, other. Yeah, that's a lot of amazing experience in the room. Very happy to see that. We haven't talked a whole lot about political campaigns, I realize. That's where I got my start, volunteering for then supervisor, now State Senator Scott Wiener, we'll get to the whole like who are your friends and who are your enemies, and no one's 100% either. But yeah, so for queer issues, we usually don't get super involved in queer issues because as Alex mentioned, in San Francisco, we have the Harvey Milk Democratic Club, we have the Alice B. Toklas Democratic Club, we have these other organizations that are focused exclusively on queer issues. So we usually don't do a lot of work in that space. The BDSM community, that's one where there's a lot of crossover with the BDSM community and the non-monogamous community as far as space is concerned. A lot of it is looking at kind of the rules in place, the zoning rules, the health code rules that impact sex positive spaces, and where we're able to have them, what rules they're under, and that, like I said, overlaps with the non-monogamous community. Actually, Supervisor Mandelman here in San Francisco recently passed a piece of legislation undoing some rules that were in place after the HIV epidemic around bathhouses, but it actually impacts other sex positive spaces as well. And it was around like mandating condom use and mandating observation to ensure condom use and like no locking doors and all the stuff that made it really difficult for sex positive spaces to exist, and also was really based in a level of understanding of HIV that is really outdated now, and is really kind of just not recognizing the place we are with science, in that we have PrEP and HIV is no longer a death sentence, and we have other tools other than just condoms, so you don't need to have this really draconian set of rules mandating that everyone must use condoms all the time. But yeah, so like the things around sex positive spaces is one of the things that we deal with for both the non-monogamous community and the BDSM community. Also, as we discussed, discrimination towards non-monogamous folks. And there's also some kind of conversation about the legal status of kink for the BDSM community. In some places, like you can't consent to what can be perceived legally as physical abuse, even though it is a thing that you are knowingly and consciously consenting to. There can be legal issues there. So that's one thing that we look at. And then for sex work, obviously we don't want sex work to be illegal. we actually held a fundraiser last December for St. James Infirmary, which is an organization here in San Francisco that provides healthcare services for sex workers and trans folks. And we raised like $1,200 for them, which was great. But yeah, so sex work is an issue that we are concerned with. But once again, there are a lot of other organizations that do work around sex work, that is their number one focus. So we just do everything we can to support them and to endorse everything they're working on and to use our voice to propel it forward. But as of yet, we don't have any current sex workers on our board. We are looking for them if you consider yourself a sex worker and would like to join our board. We're also looking to create a more diverse board generally. If you are a person of color or non-binary or trans or whatever, we are trying to make our board less white, less cis. We're luckily already majority non-male, which is great, but that could be improved as well. Yes.
Mark, if I could just tap in quick. One of the things that has come to mind, of course, especially when you mentioned about bathhouses and queer spaces, et cetera, we can't ignore the coronavirus and what that's doing to all these communities. There's been closures of bathhouses all over the Bay Area. Sex workers have been affected disproportionately. So I think that one of the ways that this club will be able to move in the forward is to help rebuild that and shape the way that looks like. And right now that we're all kind of isolated, it's a good time to get that legislative parts, kind of tuned up, and to help the community rebuild after we come out of this crisis.
Yeah. I see our fellow board member Becca in the chat pointing out that we have a legal status of kink panel next month for Folsom. We're hosting a panel around that. We also do have our watch party coming up this week for Screaming Queens, which is a documentary about Compton's cafeteria, the riots there. I see a question for a link. Becca, if you're in that chat, can you throw that link in there for legal status of kink if we have it listed yet? Amanda, do you see any other questions that we should address, or should I finish this wrap up that I have here?
I think you can finish the wrap up unless I'm missing something.
Great. So I just wanted to double back on finding out who your allies are is really important. One thing that I talk about a lot is we have this really amazing group of established legislators, activists, people who have been engaged in the legal process and the political process for a long time in the queer community, that come from this fight stemming back, to the 60s and earlier, who've been working within the halls of government and on the streets for a long time and have a track record, and also have a lot in common with us, kind of from a philosophical perspective, from an approach to the world, and from the concerns that they have. So I really frequently look to queer legislators and queer activists as our best possible allies in this fight. So in San Francisco, we're very lucky. My state senator, Senator Scott Wiener, is at the state level is doing really amazing work around PrEP and HIV, and he passed a piece of legislation that we endorsed that made it so that condoms could not be used as probable cause to convict someone of sex work. A lot of great stuff. But also he passed the nudity ban in San Francisco. So no one's perfect, right? But finding who your allies are, who it has interests that are aligned with yours, who is most likely to be convincible. Also, as we mentioned, Supervisor Mandelman passed his bathhouse legislation, and we're looking at him, hopefully, we've been in talks with him for a while about hopefully being the chief sponsor for our anti-discrimination ordinance. And we're also working with Mayor Breed's office. We have some amazing folks in there who are interested in these issues as well. So just finding who your allies are, finding who shares a worldview with you, not necessarily a progressive or moderate or whatever, however you identify yourself ideologically, but on this issue advocacy work that we're talking about, which one thing that I always say is the San Francisco Sex Positive Dems are an issue advocacy organization. We have board members from across the spectrum of the Democratic Party, from very progressive to more moderate, because these issues are really kind of outside of that ideological framework and really are issues that all folks on the left, I hope, can kind of galvanize around. Not to say that there aren't also folks who are nonpartisan and folks who at least formerly Republican, who care about these issues as well. So figure out who your allies are and just talk to them. Your local officials are, in non-quarantine times, usually really easy to find because they're all always up for re-election. So they're all always going to all Democratic club events. They're always speaking in public. They're just out there all the time. At least the ones that I am very close with. So Senator Wiener is just nonstop. The man just is everywhere all the time. It's insane. So find your local electeds, see who your allies are, talk to them. And then if there's no one, if you don't live in the Bay Area like we do, if you live in the middle of the country where everyone is deep red, or there just aren't people who are concerned about these issues, run for office yourself. Do it. Like, we need more awesome people out there advocating for these issues and other issues, right? We have Danica Rome, who's elected to the legislature in Virginia a couple of years back. She was the first trans woman to be elected to the Virginia legislature, and she wasn't running on trans issues. She was running on just make government work issues, and happened to be a trans woman, and that in some ways contributed to her success, just in being a representative for communities that don't have their voices heard. That in and of itself can be very valuable. And then the most important thing of all that you can do to make a difference in law and the world around you is vote. Please, please vote. We have one final question here for all of you before we open up to questions from you. Amanda, if you want to put that question up. The most important question of all: are you registered to vote where you live right now? I cannot emphasize enough, as Alex mentioned, some of these local races, I've heard of local races that came down to 6 votes, right? There are congressional races that come down to a precinct here or there. The margins outside of the ridiculousness that is the Electoral College, outside of like that federal level, margins on races can be really, really thin. Your vote really matters. So I cannot emphasize enough, if you are eligible to vote, please vote. And as a note for like working within the party, just a random side note, there were recently rule changes. So if you are ineligible to vote by virtue of being a non-citizen, or not old enough, or if your state still has convicted felons not able to vote, you still can join democratic organizations. Depending on the rules, in San Francisco it's allowed, and you can still do that advocacy work from within. I am so happy to see that every single one of you that is eligible to vote is registered at your current address. That makes me very, very happy. If you need to double check that you're registered in the right place, vote.org is a nonpartisan website that will allow you to look up your voter registration, look up your county registrar, all that stuff. And if anyone has any questions on voting, reach out to me. This is what I do for a living. I help people vote. I tell them how to vote, but I help them vote too. That's all that we have. I would love to open up for, I know we're over time, so please feel free to take off if you'd like to, but I'd love to open up for questions of 1 minute or less, please, or short stories of 3 minutes or less of your experiences, either of discrimination or with being a lobbyist or whatever.
Do you see a couple questions? One is the best way to reach out to you, and one is on ranked choice voting.
The best way to reach out to me, you can find me on Facebook. My name is surprisingly uncommon. I am Mark Press. I'm in San Francisco. But also, if you want to just reach out to our organization, you can email sfspdc. Oh my God, what is it? It's info at sfspdc.org. That is the San Francisco Sex Positive Democratic Club. We also have a page on Facebook that we monitor very closely. Thank you, Amanda, for posting that. And do you also want to post the Facebook page on there? Sign up for our newsletter on our website, sfspdc.org. We will keep you informed on the various events that we have coming up and the stuff that we're working on. We are trying to build our membership, and we are just we all kind of went on ice for a minute and like tried to figure this whole quarantine thing out, but we're just rebooting and we're doing at least one digital event a month for the rest of the year. Like I said, the upcoming one is Screaming Queens, which is the documentary about the Compton's cafeteria riots. We have Legal Status of Kink. We have one coming later this year on immigration and asylum for sex positive communities, which is going to be very interesting. We're hoping to do candidate forums for some local races where we ask local candidates about sex positive issues. We tend to avoid endorsing because, like I said, a lot of the fights within the Democratic Party are more about ideology and less about our issues. But we have a lot of great stuff coming up. Check out the news, sign up for the newsletter so you can stay informed. Follow us on Facebook. Feel free to reach out to me personally. Yeah, you can shoot us a message. I'll give you my cell number, phone, or email, whatever. Not on here because this is being recorded, but reach out. Any other questions or stories? I'm seeing a lot of thank yous, which I appreciate deeply in my heart. Alex, is there anything you want to add at the end of this?
Yeah, just to recap, run for office. It's very important that you kind of give it a shot if you're so inclined. A lot of times, local like elected offices, like city councils, are part-time. So that means that you can keep your day job and then you can be an activist at night, or you can get involved in your community at night. So that's my main takeaway. I think that we need more people from this community to step forward. I'm glad that, by the way, we're starting to see like this Senate candidate in Texas that is like exposing her tattoos. So I mean, that's I don't know about her preferences, but still, it's good to have that representation out there. So run for something.
Yes, run for something and vote. Amanda, anything you want to add?
No, just wanted to thank everyone for coming out to this session. I hope you do find us on Facebook or reach out to the club. We'd love to have more members. And I think that's it. I think I'll go ahead and end the meeting here.
Thank you all so much for listening while we ranted about all this stuff. I love talking about this stuff. I know Alex does too. I know Amanda does too. Please reach out to us if you have any questions. I will literally talk about this all day. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. Please reach out to me. Thank you all so much and have a great day.